Welcome to the Unity and Struggle YouTube series on race and capitalism. Unity and Struggle is a revolutionary grouping, and in this moment we see our role as mostly preparing the conditions for mass revolutionary movements to emerge. We do this by getting involved in local organizing, what some have termed base building work, and by taking theoretical study and reflection seriously. Many of us have participated in various waves of struggle dating from the 2001 anti-war movement to the more recent 2014 and 2020 Black Lives Matter movements. At times, we do intensive national studies to help make sense of the conditions that are unfolding around us, and this is one of those times. We are very excited to continue our long-term study on race and capitalism and the mutually constituting relationships between the two. This episode covers the third section of part 2 of our race study. For part 1, we synthesized lessons periodically with the Rev Left radio podcast and focused primarily on the antebellum period of the United States. You can find links to those interviews and our syllabi linked in the show notes, as well as on our website at unityandstruggle.org. We'll be continuing our study here on YouTube for part 2, and we'll be covering 3 different sections: settler colonialism, Reconstruction in the United States, and segregation and industrialization. For this episode, we'll be discussing the third section on industrialization and segregation in the United States. We don't claim to be experts, but political co-thinkers attempting to understand one dimension of the social relations of our world. So thanks for joining us in this endeavor. Share, comment, and follow along. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or on social media. Our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is at UnityandStrug. My name is Leila, and I'll be facilitating this discussion with Eve, Jamusa, and AR. So thanks to you all for joining me. So I guess let's just go get started. The first question I have for you is, how are you understanding this moment in history? And what are some theoretical tools you use to understand how race shifts in this time period?
So, this is Eve. I'll jump in on that one. So again, the time period for this section of this study is the 1880s to the 1930s, roughly. And we're looking at industrialization and segregation. So some theorists like to describe this moment in history as a transition period from formal subsumption of labor to a period of real subsumption of labor. The term subsumption describes a process in which one particular form interacts with a universal form and becomes subsumed into it. Sort of like how, if, for example, you might add like a gray dot or a gray sort of line to a painting, when you step back and look at the totality of the painting, its universal form, it's still a picture of a bowl of fruit or whatever it is, but now it has a small shaded dimension. So the dot is subsumed into the painting. Under capitalism, particular forms predate capitalism or are created by the working class, and these forms are confronted by larger universal categories. These universal categories can be cut in many different ways and viewed from various angles. So in this case, in this moment, we're looking at how particular labor processes are subsumed by capital. And the way we cut that is by looking at formal subsumption and real subsumption. So formal subsumption of labor for Marx is closely tied to absolute surplus value extraction. So capital is accumulated solely by increasing the length of the working day. If you put in 12 hours of labor, you create 12 hours worth of wealth, period. Real subsumption of labor is closely tied to relative surplus value. So under real subsumption of labor, the capitalist invests in machinery and reorganizes working conditions in order to extract additional surplus labor. So in this case, a new conveyor belt system or tailorist methods will allow a factory of people to produce twice the products in half the time. This opens up all sorts of possibilities, including increased wages. So we must keep in mind that real subsumption of labor create an abstracted appearance of additional worker wealth. So it appears as though workers are better off because wages and standards of living increase. However, this is relative to the enormous new profits that capitalists can make. So in essence, workers are increasingly exploited. As the old Marx quote goes, in A Strange Labor, the more wealth the worker produces, the poorer they become. This point is important when comparing real versus formal subsumption of labor, because even though a 20th century unskilled or semi-skilled factory worker appears to have a better situation than a 19th century agricultural worker, the relative levels of exploitation could be very similar. So there's a basis for solidarity here. So what does all of this have to do with our race study and this moment in history? Get to the point, Eve. Basically, in this moment of our race study, we looked at, again, sort of like the Great Migration, and, a really important moment in history where a lot is changing. And new forms of segregation are being thrown up. There's racial discrimination in the workplace and in neighborhoods. There's increased criminalization popping up that reshapes and reforms race and race relations as a whole. So some argue that this marks a shift for Black people from facing formal subsumption of labor in agricultural settings in the South to real subsumption of labor in northern factories. So first, what didn't we find useful from this analysis? Because there's always, with a lot of these things that we're reading, we have some critiques. We have, we're kind of synthesizing a lot of different traditions. So sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. There's always something to learn and some things to throw away. So first, what didn't we find useful? In our study, we tried to complicate sort of the periodization arguments, and instead, we think that both forms of subsumption exist simultaneously. This is important in order to have a method that's not deterministic or stagist, or a sort of indifferent capitalism method that argues that race is just a coincidental byproduct of these various stages of capitalist development. While historically it does check out that many Black people in the US were facing real subsumption of labor in this time period, we also see that Black racialization in this moment is still tethered to conditions of unfree labor, which can make use of both formal and real subsumption of labor, depending on how capital is shifting at any given moment or place. So what did we find useful in these categories? I think what's most helpful is the way these processes of subsumption are in metabolic relationship with racialization processes, and how racialization and gendering, for example, can be seen as particulars that are subsumed into these more universal forms. So, for example, a shift from formal subsumption to real subsumption of labor marks a new level of abstraction. A worker can no longer see directly how much work they're putting into something, and therefore the product that they're creating. So the amount of wealth they're producing becomes kind of abstracted and largely unknown. So if you'd indulge me with the Fanon quote, I'm wrapping this up soon. I know it's not the best sort of intro, but it's important categories. But if you'd indulge me a bit with a Fanon quote, he says, "Vulgar racism in its biological form corresponds to the period of crude exploitation of man's arms and legs. The perfecting of the means of production inevitably brings about the camouflage of the techniques by which man is exploited, hence the forms of racism. In this moment, the condition of unfree labor, or Black people as the direct property of white people, is no longer synonymous with Blackness. What it means to be Black affixes to other things like criminalization and surplus labor, etc. These are all things we're going to go into it in a bit. And importantly, this abstraction creates a lot of destabilization among racial categories."
So, based on that Fanon quote, it seems like the definition of race is shifting during this time. So, Jamusa, how does race prove to be unstable in this time period? And, what do we mean when we say racial instability?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So, I'll just say that a number of our readings dealt with this. 3 of them were Glenn's Unequal Freedoms, Trotter's Workers on Arrival, and Rodiger's Working Toward Whiteness. And just to preface all this, too, we're looking beyond just the black-white binary, especially with the Glenn Unequal Freedoms. That's really looking at the chapters Mexicans and Anglos in the Southwest. So really there's kind of an idea of like the the state and capital and what that's meaning at this time, the shifting terrain, unequalness, instability of race in the late 19th century, early 20th centuries, where again basically there's racialization as a process, and there's social meaning that's read onto bodies. All of this, of course, in under kind of like a anti-blackness, it's kind of that as kind of a start, but you have again not just the black-white binary, but again also Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, and so-called white ethnics, or new white immigrants, what are then later white immigrants from Europe as well. So there's basically that idea of how is the state, how are they categorizing legally individuals as well. So there's kind of a contested way of citizenship in this case. Looking at, for instance, the Glenn book, it looks at the Southwest, so Anglos, white people moving into what's now Texas or the Southwest, and really kind of a shifting terrain of like, are Mexican or Mexican Americans, what is their relationship between these Anglos? Are they white, something else? What is their also relationship as it is to blacks or African Americans as well? So there's a lot of different ways that different states, be it California, Texas, others, how they legally defined Mexican and Mexican Americans. Now, keep in mind, too, that Mexico being a colonial settler entity as well, that really plays into it as well. So what did, the Spanish Empire, what was now Mexico, what was their relationship with indigenous peoples, and how did, again, later people that are now Mexicans or Tejanos, what was their relationship to the land, and what is their relationship to capital later with Anglos coming in? So you really kind of see this kind of shifting terrain of like Anglos, as they're called, coming in different, again, rules or states in terms of like marriage, Mexican American women, marrying whites or marrying African Americans as well, maybe less so. How's the state really kind of, how are they dealing with that? How is society dealing that without? So that's kind of on a societal level, again, looking at the Southwest and South as well. So you have that as a interesting example as well. One other thing you can kind of look at too is David Rodriguez kind of looking at how the Irish became whiter, in this case more of like the Italians or Eastern Europeans becoming white, and this being a material and social benefit. But what does that really mean? The idea of kind of attaining, maybe eventually having full citizenship, maybe a certain level of standard of living, but also having, with that mind too, there's still access of labor to black and indigenous folks too. So there's still this kind of anti-blackness going on as well, in comparison to, again, a wages of whiteness or a full recognition eventually that many the white immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th century get. So you kind of put that in that context. What I would say in terms of like labor and what that's meant in terms of fluctuation or racial instability, you kind of see that in rural settings. Again, the idea of like Mexican and Mexican Americans, maybe some of them were landowners being pushed off that land into to be in waged work, or maybe having to work the land for wages, which they didn't have to before. Or again, the idea of of who is a citizen, or even the idea of the border. I think one of the readings suggesting that the immigration or the border crossings weren't even counted until maybe the 1920s. So where's the border? Is the border crossed us? That type of thing as well. And what has that meant in terms of like othering of Mexican American folks as well? I would say also in workplaces, Trotter's reading really kind of talks about that as well, in terms of like the type of jobs folks were able to do, the fluidity of that, and also kind of the racism among, again, in certain places. So maybe the anti-black racism, the way that it's kind of used by whites to kind of divide black and Latinx folks as well. So just noticing, like in the West or Southwest, there was a good example from Los Angeles, I think from the 20s, where Latinx folks were classified in some workplaces as colored, maybe grouped with black workers. Other employers maybe saw Mexicans as white, prohibiting interaction with African Americans, and sometimes even making Latinx folks bosses to African Americans as well. Of course, they wouldn't have the African Americans as bosses. So there's really kind of that sense, but of course it's all under kind of white supremacy. So you kind of keep that in mind, that there is this, not that it's necessarily static of who's white, the white-black binary, I should say, but there's really kind of this in-betweenness, and it's depending on place, the state itself, certain social conditions, certain workplaces as well. So that's really something you have to think about, is like, who's really dictating this racial instability, an objective and subjective point, again, coerced via the state, via capital. It's maybe sometimes reformed in moments of crises as well. It can return to the old forms, or there's these new forms that may come up that evolved over time, again, in this late 19th century and early 20th century, that really, kind of subsumed this and, had this type of newer ideas. In this case, more recently, we may think of like diversity and inclusion. But again, that's really kind of changed in those time periods as well, to really kind of set up a racialization going forward up through World War II, and what maybe some of us are more, quote unquote, familiar with going through the 20th century.
Wow. So it seems like the boundaries of race are kind of all over the place during this time period. So, AR, how are institutions responding to these shifting definitions?
Great question, and Jamusa set me up really well to kind of expand on some of what he's talked about. There's a lot of this, just instability and just, this process of kind of cohering some of these racial categories. And, formal institutions are, of course, not the only places where these changes are taking place, but they're grappling with these changes as well in really interesting ways. Sometimes looking to so-called like scientific experts, you see race science taking even more prominence during this time. You kind of hear the emergence of this idea of race suicide with anxiety about new immigrants. You see a lot of grappling over whether race is, really defined or marked by biological or cultural or even, moral differences across humanity, or all of the above. And as, Jamusa said earlier, a lot of this is still very clearly understood through anti-Blackness, but for these kind of in-between sort of groups, as I'm kind of, borrowing some of the terminology from some of the authors here, institutions are doing some interesting things and, just again, really kind of struggling with this. So kind of looking at Glenn's unequal freedoms, a really important moment is 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So this, is effectively ending the war with Mexico, and as part of the treaty, citizenship for Mexicans who decide to stay in the Southwest is codified in law. But of course, we know things are much more complicated than that. And so even just the next year in 1849, there's this intense debate in the California Constitutional Convention over the piece of the Constitution that, says suffrage is really for white male citizens. So you see this kind of debate whether, that means that Mexicans are white, or how do we understand this? What is the place of Mexicans? And so you have some of the landowning elite who are more easily understood, due to their, ties to Europe, European ancestry, but then, a more complicated understanding as it pertains to more working class people. At this, during this time, we also see this pretty radical transformation of the landowning system. We've kind of talked about citizenship and types of labor being really important to how these shifting definitions of race are kind of getting molded. So you really see a shift from a more traditional patrimonial Mexican landowning system to a more Americanized, very legally codified system of land titles. So you really see a lot of shift in the type of labor that Mexicans in the Southwest are doing, and kind of this, downward social trajectory. So the place of Mexicans in the Southwest starts to look more and more like a subordinate race or class, even if they're not officially, according to the U.S. government, distinct from whites for official purposes. So up until the 1930s, the U.S. government did not distinguish Mexicans from whites. They were considered white foreign-born, which is kind of in contrast to Asian immigrants. So, we see this kind of, de facto sort of segregation emerging and kind of extra legal practices that help kind of maintain that social order that's emerging. We see the invention of things like white man's primaries in Texas, where essentially the thinking is that, Mexicans are too irresponsible to really be involved in primary elections. So you see this, sharp decline in Mexicans that are actually participating and voting. You see de facto segregation in most public spaces. And then, schools are an important part of this. So in the Southwest, schools were not originally segregated. This was kind of a process that happened over time. And again, we have legal segregation of, Blacks, Asians, Native Americans, but finding some extra legal ways to segregate Mexicans because of their formal white status. And so you see this in new, again, race science influence, educational theory about how to best educate these suboptimal populations. There's kind of this reasoning that Mexicans who are not, fluent in English will degrade the quality of education for white students, and so therefore, they can be, educated separately. You see, a different school year calendar emerge for the Mexican schools. That's much more focused around being available to labor in the afternoon or, during specific periods of time. So the school year is actually shorter. The school day is shorter in the Mexican schools. Really the quality of education and the funding is very poor because effectively schools that teach Mexican students can't be funded by whites. The heterogeneity that had been recognized previously is essentially gone, and Anglos in the Southwest, collapse everyone into the category of Mexican. And while white, in terms of the law, effectively non-white. The other piece that's really interesting that I drew a lot from in terms of how institutions are dealing with this, the Working Towards Whiteness piece by Roediger. So, he's focusing more on the racial understanding of these new European immigrants. One thing I thought was really interesting is that until 1898, there really wasn't any kind of counting by race in terms of immigration that was implemented by the Commissioner General with some rather unclear guidelines because there actually weren't any forms that asked immigrants to racially identify. It was kind of done by observation or some other questioning about their language spoken or country of origin. So, again, being careful to not use the category of ethnicity because that kind of emerges later as a way to understand what's happening. Really, the understanding of race at this time, it's very complicated when it comes to European immigrants in particular. So in 1888, one of the sources cited by Roediger, they stated that there's between 2 and 63 races. In 1924, there was a Supreme Court hearing that cited some scientific evidence saying that there was anywhere between 4 and 49 races, and most of those being very, very minute distinctions between Europeans. There was relatively clear distinction between whites versus blacks, American Indians, Chinese immigrants, etc., but a lot of contestation about, these new European immigrants. Again, the kind of popularization of the concept of race suicide, so a lot of anxieties about the U.S. losing its racial moorings. Going back to education, this is kind of a space where a lot of this is playing out, where different groups are going to be determined whether they're assimilable or whether they're not. The idea being that, some groups are just, you basically need to mitigate against their influence in society, right? Like, need to segregate and keep them separate. Whereas other groups are, potentially American, potentially citizens, but maybe it's going to be kind of a generational process. And so, kind of reading a quote here, the task is to break up their groups or settlements, assimilate and amalgamate, implant in their children Anglo-Saxon conception of law and order and popular government. So the idea that, again, some of these groups are able to be incorporated into whiteness, whereas other groups, you may need to just kind of segregate them. Of course, have to mention, Indian boarding schools and Indian, day schools at the time, as, another project in this. I think we've kind of all heard the adage, you have to kill the Indian to save the man. So we're seeing, this process by which, different groups are forced to assimilate, these different processes of cultural genocide.
Okay. So during this time period, the women's suffrage movement is also gaining steam. So what do the texts say about gender in relation to race in this time period?
Yeah, this is Jamusa again. So I'll take that, although it's interesting that, at least the two readings that I'm going to talk to don't necessarily talk about suffrage. I mean, mostly I'm going to be kind of talking about African-American women and Mexican or Mexican-American women, although, again, that's all in the context of, their relation to white women and white supremacy and also patriarchy as well, or the how white women are gendered and how this gendering process as well that's kind of going on at the same time as this racialization. So starting with Trotter, at this time, again, there's still a majority of African-American women, if they're not working, in rural or in even the north and south and urban areas, still kind of working in, number of still working in domestic household service as well. So there's kind of the idea that, black women that went to the north were all in industrial jobs, and that's not true, though there's quite a bit that were compared to, places in the rural south. But, with that in mind, you have this idea of the access of white people, but white women having access to black women as domestic workers for low pay and, or no pay. Also this white perception of still having this master servant thing going on in domestic work as well too. So you have that. So with that, you have some women that are African-American women that are kind of fighting back in some way in terms of moving to the north or to urban areas in the south. I know Trotter quoted some black women adopting the model of white women to the kitchen, or WWTK, and this going up through until World War II. So this idea like we're going to, go to urban jobs, go into industrial jobs as well, and and the white women need to take care of themselves and go to the kitchen as well. But with that said, you still have the access of the type of jobs that were available to African American women. This case is still kind of really problematic in terms of like industrial. There's only certain jobs, very low paying. Some of them really quite dangerous too, that are still available as well. And that's also the case for, either black men, immigrants as well, white women as well, in terms of this stratification of the workplace, which we still frankly see today. And, you might see in your own workplace as well, or where you go out to, wherever in different workplaces in your community as well, you might see that and be like, things really haven't changed in over 100 years, or they changed in some ways, but really not. So, with that said, again, this idea of low pay, just a racial and gender ceiling as well as certain jobs, of course, never supervisors, and blacks being paid less than whites for the same work, maybe being labeled as, quote, helpers as well. That was for men and women as well. So another thing is this idea of kind of black women being masculinized, kind of this heavy and dangerous work in certain factories as well. The idea that, white women weren't, quote, fit for this type of work. So this may be hypersexualization or criminalization. Also kind of a pathology or pathologization. Not saying that word quite correctly, but I know in the future we're going to be looking at works by Saidiya Hartman as well that kind of talk about that, who's a famous African American theorist, historian as well, and gender studies theorist as well. One other thing, too, I know that Trotter has mentioned the idea, again, in the North of some black women, many of them might have been working class or poor that are maybe in precarious situations, maybe suggesting or maybe choosing informal sex work that might be paying better than household service work. But with that, there's a subject to police harassment, criminalization, that's potential as well with that. So, but that's kind of mentioned a choice that some women maybe made or maybe were forced to make. The author doesn't necessarily kind of brings that out, but maybe could elaborate more. But they do have that as well in that. Going over to the Glenn piece, looking at Mexican and Mexican American women, I know I kind of maybe hinted at this before, but the idea that some were doing farm labor that they may not have done earlier, that may have been kind of landowners or adjacent that were maybe pushed off by Anglos in the West or Southwest that are now doing this wage work or either housework or maybe again farm work as well. So that kind of both gendered and also kind of this unstable racialization going on as well. I know I've been focusing on the workplace as well, but there's also the instability with categories in intermarriage and law. I know AR kind of talked about that too as well. But again, this idea of kind of intermarriage as well, that was kind of talked about, maybe Anglo men marrying Mexican women earlier in the time period, but seen as maybe socially okay in some places, less so in others. And then after 1880, maybe a stricter Anglification of that. This had implications for communities and constructions of social relations and race. And again, like I said as well earlier, relation between African Americans and Mexican Americans in the West and Southwest, and really kind of being precarious or really kind of ever changing or shifting. And I think gender also played a role in that too as well. So we have to think about that also with Asian American as well. So summarize a little bit, kind of this gendering of Mexican women and also gendering of African American women too is really this connected to the gendering of white women. And there's some similarities, but also a lot of differences as this racialization is really mediating gender, under the state and capital as well.
Okay, awesome. So, what are the practical implications of all of this?
I can go first on that. Yeah, I think I had sort of an aha moment reading this section because for my local organizing, most people in Unity and Struggle also do local organizing. So what I do is around prison abolition and specifically around one prison in my neighborhood. At one point, we were having a discussion in our group about the history of prisons and abolition struggles. And a question came up because the prison in my neighborhood is pretty multiracial. It's not your sort of typical, most prisons are multiracial, but it's not majority Black. And, it's uniquely, there are a lot of white people in this facility. And so this question came up about why talk about abolition and specifically the struggle around this one facility as a project that affects Black people in particular. And I thought this was helpful in applying some of the lessons from the study here, because I think sometimes people sort of approach abolitionist struggle through the lens of, kind of a moralistic standpoint, like it's necessarily a Black issue. Prisons are anti-Black, but there isn't really sort of like an objective analysis of why that's the case. And I think tracing the history of white supremacy from slavery to the Reconstruction moment, which sort of introduces this element of criminality, and then I think becomes solidified in this moment post Reconstruction and through segregation practices and discrimination practices. And again, like sort of this abstraction of race was really important in understanding sort of like the objective analysis of how this prison in particular is like tied to a legacy of anti-Black racism. And so even if it just so happens that there are a lot of white people in this facility, and, you know, some of the people coming around the fight are white, it's still necessarily a project that is fighting against anti-Black racism. And, you know, a lot of the quote unquote crimes that people are caught up in this facility, or, you know, in prisons in general, are only a product of being disciplined for not living up to standards of whiteness, and in order to, you know, further the project of anti-Black racism. So, yeah, I thought that was pretty helpful. And I think it has a lot of practical implications for how to have these conversations and, you know, what shapes our fights.
I totally agree with Eve. I also drew some contemporary and practical lessons from this section. One thing that really stood out to me is, you know, when we're thinking about, you know, racialization processes and concepts of race outside the black-white binary, just how anti-Blackness is just still underlying all of that. A lot of these processes of racialization that are covered in this section are really processes of groups of people differentiating themselves from Blackness. And kind of, you know, the tragedy of that, there's some examples in the Working Towards Whiteness where maybe there would have been an opportunity for some solidarity with shared conditions, but really that became all the more incentive to push towards whiteness and assimilate and gain a social position that was in contrast to Blackness. So I think that's an important lesson there, and, you know, something that we still see and struggle with in groups that maybe don't fall within that black-white binary. You know, there's a lot of thought and debate about Mexican Americans, you know, Latinos, Latinx, you know, whatever terminology you prefer. Are there reasons to believe that, you know, a process of becoming white could be underway for certain parts of those groups? So I think that's something that's really important to think about is anti-Blackness in these racialization processes.
So what's next for this project?
So next for this project, we're going to take a little break. We've been going strong for a while, so we're going to pause and just, you know, make sure that the next section of the study, the next part of the study, is well thought out and put together. We may be seeking some feedback on it, so watch out for that. And we'll definitely make public what we decide to read for part 3. Part 3 is going to take us from the civil rights era through Black Power, Third World Liberation, and into the neoliberal era in our sort of current configuration of race relations. So in a few months, we'll be back with more content on that, and we hope that people will follow along and definitely give some feedback.
Okay, that's exciting. Okay, so this concludes this episode. I'm thankful to Unity and Struggle for putting on this race study, and to Eve, Jamusa, and AR in particular for sharing their thoughts and analysis. This concludes part 2 of the race study, as Eve mentioned, but be sure to subscribe so you can follow along for future studies. Thanks so much for joining us in this endeavor, and please share and comment on this episode to expand our reach. We'd love to hear from you on social media as well. Our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram is @UnityandStrug. Thank you very much.